Morgan Blackwell's hands shook as he watched the petite horse whisperer walk straight into the corral with the savage Mustang that had put 2 of his men in the hospital. Her eyes locked with his across the yard, and in that moment, he realized she saw through his rough exterior with the same unnerving clarity she used to tame the wildest of beasts. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Morgan Blackwell stood at the edge of his ranch, watching the wild Mustang he'd captured 3 days ago, still bucking against the constraints of the corral. Every approach he'd made had been met with flattened ears and snapping teeth. The stallion's coat gleamed russet in the morning sun, muscles rippling beneath as it paced the perimeter of its enclosure like a caged predator. Beautiful and dangerous, a combination Morgan respected and understood all too well. "That one's not breaking anytime soon," came Pete's voice from behind him. His foreman of 15 years leaned against the fence post, chewing on a piece of grass stem. "Maybe we should cut our losses." Morgan shook his head, the brim of his worn Stetson shielding his eyes from the harsh Montana sun. "Not yet." At 52, Morgan knew his reputation in Clearwater Valley. Hardened widower, successful rancher, difficult employer. The last part wasn't entirely fair. He was demanding but just. The first 2 were accurate enough. 10 years since Sarah's passing, and the sprawling ranch house still felt too empty, too quiet. The business had prospered under his single-minded focus, but little else in his life had. "Boss, we've tried everything short of getting yourself trampled. None of the boys can get near him, and you know Jake's the best horsebreaker in 3 counties. Morgan's jaw tightened. The Mustang reminded him too much of himself, wary, untrusting, preferring solitude to submission. "I heard someone new moved into the old Davidson place, some kind of horse specialist." Pete snorted. "That city girl, Emma Lawrence? Heard she calls herself a horse whisperer or some such nonsense. Claims she can gentle them without breaking their spirit." Morgan had heard the rumors too. A woman in her 30s who'd abandoned some fancy equine therapy practice back east to set up in their remote Montana valley. The locals had been buzzing about her for weeks, opinions divided between skepticism and curiosity. "Call her," Morgan said finally. Pete's eyebrows shot up. "You serious, boss? Never known you to ask for outside help, especially not from—" "Just make the call, Pete." Morgan turned away, his gaze fixed on the defiant Mustang. "Tell her I'll pay double her rate." That evening, Morgan sat alone on his porch, nursing a glass of whiskey and watching the sun sink behind the mountains. The ranch spread before him, 5,000 acres of prime grazing land, 300 head of cattle, 24 quarter horses, and now 1 unmanageable Mustang. The empire he'd built from the modest operation his father had left him. It should have been enough. The sound of tires on gravel drew his attention. A dusty blue pickup truck he didn't recognize was coming up the drive, moving slowly as if the driver was uncertain. Morgan set down his glass and stood, squinting against the setting sun. The truck came to a stop and a woman emerged. Not what he'd expected. She was tall and slim, wearing practical jeans, boots, and a light flannel shirt despite the summer heat. Her hair was pulled back in a simple braid, her face free of makeup, skin weathered enough to suggest she wasn't as city as rumors claimed. She moved with quiet confidence, taking in the ranch with an appraising gaze before her eyes settled on him. "Mr. Blackwell?" She approached the porch, hand extended. "I'm Emma Lawrence. Your foreman said you have a Mustang that needs attention." Her handshake was firm, her eyes direct. Green, he noticed, with small flecks of gold. A scattered constellation of freckles crossed her nose and cheeks. "Morgan," he corrected, releasing her hand. "And yes, caught him in the north pasture 3 days ago. None of my men can get near him. May I see him now? I prefer to make first introductions in the evening when they're calmer." Morgan nodded, leading her toward the corral without further conversation. The Mustang was still pacing, though with less energy than earlier. When they approached, the horse stopped, nostrils flaring, ears swiveling toward them. Emma made no move to enter the enclosure. Instead, she simply stood, observing the animal with unwavering attention. Morgan found himself studying her profile, the determined set of her jaw, the slight furrow between her brows. She seemed completely absorbed, as though having a silent conversation with the horse. "What's his name?" she asked after several minutes. Morgan shrugged. "Don't have one. Haven't been able to do much besides get him in the corral." She nodded thoughtfully. "He's magnificent. Probably 3 or 4 years old, never been handled. Spanish Mustang bloodlines, I'd guess." She turned to Morgan. "Why this one? You have plenty of trained horses." The directness of her question caught him off guard. Most locals knew better than to ask Morgan Blackwell personal questions, but looking at the Mustang's defiant stance, he found himself answering truthfully. "Saw him leading a small herd last spring. He protected them when a mountain lion came too close. Lost one of his mares but saved the others. Thought an animal with that kind of heart deserved better than mountain predators or government roundups." Emma's expression softened slightly. "So you admire him?" "I respect what he is," Morgan corrected. "That's a good start." She turned back to the Mustang. "I'll need to work with him daily for at least 2 weeks, preferably in the early morning and evening. Is that acceptable?" Morgan nodded, surprised at her businesslike approach. "Whatever it takes." "I don't use force, Mr. Blackwell. My methods require patience and consistency. The Mustang will decide when he's ready to trust. We can't make that choice for him." There was something in her tone, a gentle firmness, that hinted she wasn't just talking about the horse. Morgan bristled slightly but kept his expression neutral. "As I said, whatever it takes. Pete will show you around tomorrow morning. We start work at dawn." Emma held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. "I'll be here at sunrise, and Mr. Blackwell, the horse needs a name. It's the first step to forming a connection." As she walked back to her truck, Morgan watched her go, struck by the strange sense that he'd just been assessed as thoroughly as she'd assessed the Mustang, and he wasn't entirely sure he'd passed muster. That night, lying in bed, Morgan found himself thinking about names for the wild stallion, and if his thoughts occasionally drifted to a pair of steady green eyes and a no-nonsense voice, he attributed it to simple curiosity about whether his money would be well spent on this so-called horse whisperer. Dawn broke over Clearwater Valley in a wash of pink and gold, the mountains to the east silhouetted against the brightening sky. Morgan was already on his second cup of coffee when he spotted Emma's truck coming up the drive. Punctual, he had to give her that. He met her at the corral, where she stood quietly observing the Mustang in the growing light. The horse eyed her warily from the far corner, head high and alert. "I've decided to call him Ember," Morgan said, breaking the silence. "For his color." Emma nodded, a hint of approval in her expression. "Good name. Strong but not aggressive." She set down the small pack she'd brought and turned to him. "I need to explain how this works. I don't perform miracles, Mr. Blackwell. What I do is create opportunities for trust to develop naturally." "Morgan," he reminded her, "and I'm not expecting miracles, just results." "Fair enough." She gestured to the corral. "For today, I just need to sit with him. No halters, no ropes, just sharing space. You're welcome to watch, but from outside the fence, and preferably without staring directly at him." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "That's your method? Sitting?" "Partly." She met his skepticism with calm assurance. "Horses are prey animals, Mr. Blackwell. Everything in their instincts tells them humans are predators. Our goal is to convince him otherwise. That starts with respecting his space while gradually bringing our worlds closer together. Before Morgan could respond, Emma had slipped through the fence rails and entered the corral. The Mustang, Ember, immediately tensed, nostrils flaring. Morgan instinctively moved forward, concerned for her safety, but Emma's raised hand stopped him. She made no move toward the horse. Instead, she simply walked to the center of the corral, sat down cross-legged in the dirt, and opened her pack. From it, she took an apple, cut it with a small knife, and began eating slices, seemingly ignoring the nervous stallion. Morgan watched, fascinated despite himself. He'd seen plenty of horse trainers in his time, but never one who started like this. After about 15 minutes, during which Emma occasionally shifted position, but mostly just sat quietly eating her apple, something remarkable happened. Ember took 3 steps toward her, still keeping his distance, but clearly curious. Emma didn't react, didn't turn to look, just continued her calm presence. After another 10 minutes, she stood slowly, still not looking directly at the horse, and left the corral without any attempt to approach him. "That's it?" Morgan asked, unable to hide his disappointment. Emma brushed the dust from her jeans. "That's day 1. I'll be back this evening for another session." She must have seen the doubt in his expression because she added, "Trust is earned in drops and lost in buckets, Morgan. True with horses, true with people." He found himself nodding despite his skepticism. "Will you need anything else set up for this evening?" "Just a chair for you. If you're going to watch, might as well be comfortable." There was the slightest twinkle in her eye. "I have a feeling you're not a man who likes to miss much happening on his property." Morgan couldn't argue with that assessment. "I'll be here." Throughout the day, he found his thoughts drifting to Emma Lawrence and her unusual methods. When evening came, he positioned a chair outside the corral as suggested, trying not to feel foolish about it. Emma arrived exactly when she said she would, this time carrying a small battery-powered radio. At Morgan's questioning look, she explained, "Horses need to get used to human sounds. Music helps bridge that gap." Once again, she entered the corral and sat, this time with soft classical music playing. The Mustang seemed less agitated than in the morning, even venturing closer at one point before skittering away. "How did you get into this work?" Morgan asked during a particularly long stretch of silence. Emma was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. "I was thrown from a horse when I was 12, she finally said, her voice soft but carrying in the evening stillness. "Bad fall. Broke my back. Doctors said I might not walk again." Morgan found himself leaning forward, drawn into her story despite himself. "While I was recovering, my grandfather brought a young mare to my window every day. Couldn't ride, but I could watch her, talk to her." Emma's face softened with the memory. "When I finally got out of the hospital, that mare was the first one to let me on her back. Gentlest creature I've ever known." "So you decided to train horses?" "Not exactly. I became a physical therapist, actually. Specialized in equine therapy for disabled children." She glanced at him. "The horse whispering came later after my grandfather died and left me his methods in a journal. I realized I could help horses the way that mare helped me." Morgan nodded, a new understanding dawning. "And Montana? That's a long way from wherever back east you're from." "Philadelphia. And yes, it is." Something in her tone suggested there was more to that story, but she didn't elaborate. Instead, she slowly rose and, to Morgan's surprise, began humming along with the music, her movements deliberate but graceful as she simply walked in a wide circle, still not approaching Ember directly. The Mustang watched her, ears forward now, curiosity evident in his posture. Emma completed her circuit and left the corral, turning off the music. 2 sessions a day for the first week, she said. By next weekend, we might be ready for first touch. Seems slow, Morgan observed, though without the criticism that might have been in his voice yesterday. Most worthwhile things are. She gathered her things, then paused. When was the last time someone new earned your trust, Morgan? The question caught him off guard, uncomfortably personal, and yet asked with such straightforward simplicity that it didn't feel intrusive. Been a while, he admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. Emma nodded as if he'd confirmed something she'd suspected. "See you at dawn," she said, and headed to her truck. Morgan stayed in his chair long after her taillights had disappeared down his drive, watching Ember in the gathering darkness. The Mustang stood more relaxed now, occasionally looking toward where Emma had sat. For the first time in longer than he cared to admit, Morgan found himself looking forward to the morning. By the 5th day of Emma's visits, a subtle shift had occurred in the rhythm of Morgan's ranch. The hands had grown accustomed to her truck coming up the drive at dawn and dusk, and Morgan found himself unconsciously tracking the time, making sure he was near the corral when she arrived. He told himself it was natural curiosity about her methods, professional interest in his investment. This morning he'd brought an extra thermos of coffee, which she accepted with a grateful smile that momentarily softened her usually composed features. "Making progress," she observed, nodding toward Ember. The Mustang now grazed comfortably while Emma sat in the corral, no longer retreating to the furthest corner when she entered. "Still haven't touched him," Morgan pointed out, though without his initial skepticism. "No, but he's considering the possibility that I might not be a threat." She sipped her coffee, eyes on the horse. That's no small thing for an animal who's known nothing but freedom and danger. Morgan leaned against the fence post, hat tipped back. "The men are taking bets on whether you'll be able to ride him by the end of the month." Emma's eyebrow arched slightly. "And what did you bet?" "That you wouldn't try to ride him at all." At her surprised look, he added, "Been watching you work. You're not after dominance, you're after partnership." Something like approval flickered in her eyes. "Good observation." They fell into a comfortable silence as Emma entered the corral for her morning session. Today she brought a book and read aloud occasionally, her voice carrying softly in the clear morning air. To Morgan's amazement, Ember gradually moved closer, eventually grazing barely 15 feet from where she sat. "What are you reading to him?" Morgan asked when she emerged an hour later. "Steinbeck, The Red Pony." At his raised eyebrow, she smiled. "Not the most cheerful horse story I know, but it's about connection. Animals understand more than we give them credit for." "You really believe that? That he understands the story?" "Not the words, the intention behind them." She brushed dust from her jeans. "When was the last time someone read to you, Morgan?" The question caught him off guard. "My wife," he said before he could think better of it. "Sarah, before she got sick." Emma nodded, not pushing further, but acknowledging the rare personal detail he'd offered. Reading connects people, creates a shared experience even in silence. As she packed up to leave, Pete approached with a concerned expression. "Boss, we've got trouble with the herd in the north pasture, counting at least 3 missing calves." Morgan's posture immediately changed, shoulders tensing. "Mountain lion again?" "Maybe. Found some tracks by the creek." Morgan nodded grimly. "Get the rifles. We'll head out in 20. Emma, who had been listening, spoke up. "Mind if I come along? I know these mountains pretty well." Both men looked at her with surprise. Pete's expression clearly suggested he thought she'd be in the way. "Not a pleasure ride," Morgan said. "Could be dangerous." "I grew up hunting with my grandfather," she replied evenly. "And I've tracked predators before. 2 eyes see less than 4. Something in her steady gaze convinced him. "Saddle the bay mare for Ms. Lawrence," he instructed Pete, who looked like he wanted to object but knew better. An hour later they rode out with 4 ranch hands heading toward the northern boundary where the Blackwell property met National Forest land. Morgan found himself impressed by Emma's seat in the saddle, confident and natural, moving with the horse rather than against it. The bay mare, normally skittish with strangers, seemed perfectly at ease under her guidance. "You ride well," he observed as they picked their way through a rocky stretch of trail. "My grandfather's influence again. He believed a person wasn't complete unless they could communicate with horses." She adjusted her hat against the midday sun. "He'd have liked your operation here. Traditional but not cruel." Morgan felt an unexpected warmth at the assessment. "Try to do right by the animals. They give us their lives and labor. Least we can do is treat them with respect." The search took them deep into the foothills, following tracks that confirmed Morgan's fears. A mountain lion had indeed been hunting his calves. They found the remains of one near a stream, fresh enough to indicate the predator might still be nearby. "We'll split up," Morgan told the group. "Pete, you take Jake and head west along the ridge. Tom and Bill, check the eastern draw. Emma and I will follow the stream north." As they rode away from the others, Morgan kept his rifle ready across his saddle. "Stay close," he instructed. "These cats are ambush predators. They don't typically attack humans, but when they're hunting—" "I understand," Emma said quietly, scanning the rocky outcroppings above them. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, following the faint tracks along the stream bank. The canyon narrowed, forcing them to ride single file, Morgan in the lead. When he raised his hand suddenly, Emma stopped her mare immediately. Ahead, drinking from the stream, were the two missing calves. Remarkably, they appeared unharmed, though clearly separated from the herd. Morgan dismounted slowly, passing his reins to Emma. "I'll bring them up," he whispered. "Keep watch." Emma nodded, her eyes continuously scanning the hillsides. Morgan had just reached the first calf when she called out sharply, "3 o'clock on the ledge." He spun, rifle ready, to see the mountain lion poised on a rock outcropping 30 yards away. The large cat was perfectly still, tawny coat blending with the surrounding stone, yellow eyes fixed on the calves. Without hesitation, Morgan raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the rock face near the cat. The sound echoed through the canyon, startling the calves and causing the mountain lion to disappear into the brush. "Good eyes," Morgan said, heart pounding as he quickly secured a rope around the first calf's neck. Most people wouldn't have spotted him until too late. Emma had dismounted and was doing the same with the second calf. Most people look for movement. Predators are masters of stillness. Their eyes met briefly over the backs of the frightened calves, a moment of shared understanding passing between them. For the first time, Morgan saw Emma not just as an unusual horse trainer, but as a capable woman who belonged in this rugged country as naturally as the wildlife itself. The ride back was easier, the mood lighter with the calves in tow. As they approached the ranch, the sun setting behind them cast long shadows across the valley. "You surprised me today," Morgan admitted. Emma glanced at him, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "I get that a lot." The following Saturday marked a milestone. Morgan watched from his usual chair as Emma entered the corral with Ember, this time carrying a simple rope halter. She made no move to approach the Mustang directly, simply sat in her usual spot with the halter in her lap. After about 20 minutes, she stood and hung the halter on the fence post inside the corral, then continued her session as usual, reading aloud and occasionally offering apple slices that she placed on the ground between them. To Morgan's astonishment, Ember cautiously approached, sniffed at an apple piece, then took it, retreating only a few steps to eat it. By the session's end, the Mustang was eating from within arm's reach of Emma, though she still made no attempt to touch him. "He's ready," she said when she joined Morgan outside the fence. "Tomorrow morning I think he'll accept first contact." Morgan studied her face, noting the quiet satisfaction in her expression. "I've never seen anything like this," he admitted. "Most breakers would have had a rope on him by the second day, even if it meant getting kicked half to death." And they'd have a broken horse. I want Ember whole. She glanced at him. Speaking of tomorrow, I usually don't work Sundays. Would early Monday be acceptable instead? Morgan nodded, surprised at his own disappointment. He'd grown accustomed to their twice-daily meetings. Church? He asked, immediately regretting the personal question. But Emma didn't seem to mind. Not exactly. I volunteer at the children's home in town on Sundays. Reading program. Morgan raised an eyebrow. He'd lived in Clearwater Valley his entire life and had never set foot in the children's home, though he made an annual donation. Didn't know they had a reading program. They didn't until last month. She smiled slightly. Literacy and horses, my two passions. Hard to say which has saved more lives. Before Morgan could respond, a truck pulled up and Pete emerged with a concerned expression. Boss, got a call from Betty at the general store. Joe Campbell's been in town telling everyone he's putting in an offer on the Lawrence property. Emma stiffened beside him, her relaxed demeanor instantly replaced by tension. The Davidson place? Morgan clarified, glancing at Emma. Pete nodded. Seems Campbell's nephew works at the county assessor's office. Says Ms. Lawrence here is 3 months behind on property taxes. Morgan turned to Emma, whose face had gone carefully blank. That's my business, she said quietly. If you'll excuse me, I should be going. Wait. Morgan's voice stopped her as she turned toward her truck. Joe Campbell's not interested in that property for ranching. He's been trying to buy up land along the creek for some tourism development, cabins, guided fishing, that sort of thing. Again, my business. Emma's voice was cooler than he'd ever heard it. Morgan surprised himself with what he said next. Come to dinner tomorrow night, we can discuss it then. She studied him, clearly weighing her options. This isn't your problem, Morgan. Maybe not, but Campbell's been trying to change the character of this valley for years. I've got a vested interest in who my neighbors are. He held her gaze steadily. 7 o'clock, nothing fancy. After a long moment, she nodded once. Fine, 7 o'clock. As she drove away, Pete gave Morgan a curious look. Didn't realize you had an interest in the Davidson property, boss. Morgan watched her truck disappear down the drive. Neither did I. Sunday dragged interminably. Morgan found himself in his office reviewing account books, but his mind kept wandering to Emma Lawrence and her financial troubles. The Davidson property wasn't large, 120 acres with an old farmhouse and barn, but it had good water rights and a strategic location. If Joe Campbell got his hands on it, it would be the foothold he'd been seeking for years. At 6:30, Morgan found himself changing his shirt for the third time, finally settling on a blue button-down that Sarah had always said brought out his eyes. The thought of his late wife gave him pause. He hadn't entertained a guest for dinner, certainly not a woman, since Sarah's passing. The house seemed suddenly too quiet, too empty, as if highlighting all the years of solitude. Emma arrived precisely at 7, her truck rumbling up the drive. She changed from her usual work clothes into a simple dress, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of in its practical braid. The transformation was subtle but striking. You didn't need to dress up, Morgan said awkwardly as he showed her in. This isn't dressed up, she replied with a hint of amusement. This is simply not covered in dirt and horsehair. Dinner was beef stew Morgan had prepared himself, served with fresh bread from the bakery in town. To his relief, conversation flowed more easily than he'd feared. They spoke of the ranch, of Ember's progress, of books they'd both read. It wasn't until they'd moved to the living room with coffee that Morgan broached the subject of the property. How bad is the tax situation? He asked directly. Emma's face tightened, but she answered with equal directness. Bad enough. The therapy practice I sold in Philadelphia was supposed to provide a cushion, but medical bills ate through most of it. Your medical bills? I thought you recovered from your childhood injury. She looked away briefly. Not mine, my husband's. Ex-husband now. Morgan felt an unexpected jolt. She'd never mentioned being married. Cancer, she continued quietly. By the time we realized what was happening, it was already stage 4. Insurance wouldn't cover the experimental treatments, so we liquidated everything. She took a sip of her coffee. He left me a month after going into remission, said he needed a fresh start without the memories. The bitterness in her voice was so faint Morgan almost missed it, buried beneath layers of carefully constructed composure. I'm sorry, he said, meaning it. Emma shrugged. Life happens? But it left me with nothing except this opportunity to start over. My grandfather left me his methods, and a friend told me about the Davidson place. I scraped together enough for a down payment, but the income from training horses isn't steady enough yet, Morgan finished. She met his eyes directly. I'm not looking for charity, Morgan. I'll figure something out. I know you're not. He set down his cup. But I have a proposition that might benefit us both. Emma studied Morgan across the coffee table, wariness evident in her expression. What kind of proposition? A business arrangement. Morgan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The Blackwell Ranch has a reputation for quality quarter horses, but lately, several buyers have been asking about horses trained with gentler methods. He cleared his throat. Methods like yours. You want me to train your horses? I want to hire you as the ranch's official equine specialist. Full-time position with salary, benefits, housing if you want it. He paused. Or you could commute from the Davidson place, assuming you can get your tax situation sorted. Emma set her cup down carefully. And how would I do that? I'd advance you the money for the taxes. Consider it a signing bonus. You'd pay it back through your work. She was quiet for a long moment, studying him with those perceptive green eyes. Why would you do this, Morgan? You've known me for a week. I've seen enough. He stood and moved to the fireplace, suddenly finding it difficult to meet her gaze. You have a gift. Those methods of your grandfather's, they work. Not just on Ember, but I've seen how all the horses respond to you, even that ornery bay mare that tried to take a chunk out of Pete last month. So this is purely a business decision. Morgan turned back to her, knowing his face probably revealed more than he intended. No, not entirely. The admission hung between them, neither quite ready to examine its implications. Emma finally broke the silence. I need to think about it. It's a generous offer, but... She hesitated. I came here to build something of my own, not to work for someone else again. Morgan nodded, understanding. Take the time you need. Offer stands regardless of what happens with Ember. He paused, and regardless of what Campbell is planning. She rose to leave, thanking him for dinner. At the door, she turned back. Tomorrow morning, first light. You'll want to be there when Ember accepts human touch for the first time. Morgan found himself smiling, a genuine smile that felt strange on features more accustomed to stern expressions. Wouldn't miss it. After she left, he stood on the porch watching her taillights disappear, the enormity of what he'd offered settling over him. It wasn't just about saving her property or acquiring her skills for the ranch. There was something about Emma Lawrence that had breached defenses he'd spent a decade building. Something in her quiet strength and clear-eyed honesty that resonated with parts of himself he'd long neglected. Monday morning arrived with a sky still dark and full of stars. Morgan was already at the corral when Emma's truck appeared, her headlights sweeping across the yard. They exchanged quiet greetings, the air between them different now, charged with unspoken possibilities after last night's conversation. Emma entered the corral carrying the rope halter and a small cloth bag. Ember watched her from the center of the enclosure, his posture alert but not fearful. "What's in the bag?" Morgan asked softly. "Lavender and oats. Scent and food. Two things horses associate with safety." She began as she always did, sitting quietly, acknowledging the Mustang's presence, without demanding his attention. But today was different. Instead of reading or playing music, she simply held the halter in her lap, occasionally running her fingers along the rope. Ember approached more quickly than usual, drawn by the scent of the treats in her bag. He stretched his neck, nostrils flaring, still keeping a cautious distance. Emma remained perfectly still as the Mustang circled her, evaluating the situation from all angles. Morgan held his breath as Ember finally stopped directly in front of Emma, closer than he'd ever been. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Emma slowly raised her hand, palm up, offering it to the horse without reaching toward him. For several long seconds, Ember stood motionless. Then, with a soft exhale that was audible even where Morgan sat, the Mustang lowered his head and touched his muzzle to her palm. The contact lasted only seconds before Ember stepped back, processing this new experience. But the barrier had been broken. When Emma remained calm, making no sudden moves to capitalize on the moment, the horse returned. This time he allowed her to gently stroke his neck, one feather-light touch at a time. Morgan found himself unexpectedly moved by the scene. There was something profound in watching trust being born between two living beings, something that spoke to deeper yearnings than he cared to examine. After about 15 minutes of intermittent contact, Emma slowly stood, still touching Ember's neck. The horse tensed but didn't flee. With careful movements, she showed him the halter, letting him smell it, touch it with his muzzle. She made no attempt to put it on him, simply introducing it as another element in their growing relationship. When she finally left the corral, her face was alight with quiet joy. "That," she said softly to Morgan, "is why I do this work." "It's remarkable," he admitted. "Never seen anything like it." "It's not about technique, it's about patience and respect." She looked at him directly. "The same things that build trust between people." The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. Two trucks came up the drive, one belonging to Pete, the other to Joe Campbell. Morgan straightened immediately, his posture becoming defensive. Campbell emerged from his truck with the confident swagger of a man accustomed to getting his way. In his 60s, with silver hair and an expensive hat, he'd made his fortune in real estate development in Bozeman before setting his sights on Clearwater Valley. "Morgan," he called, approaching with an outstretched hand that Morgan reluctantly shook. "Heard you might be expanding your operation. Thought I'd stop by to discuss some mutually beneficial opportunities." His gaze shifted to Emma, and something calculating entered his expression. "Ms. Lawrence, what a surprise finding you here. Just came from the county office, as a matter of fact. Interesting situation with the Davidson property." Emma's face remained impassive, though Morgan could sense her tension. "What brings you out here, Joe?" Morgan asked, deliberately stepping slightly in front of Emma, in a protective gesture that wasn't lost on Campbell. "Like I said, opportunities. I've got plans for this valley that could benefit everyone." His smile didn't reach his eyes, especially those who might be facing financial challenges. The implication hung in the air, a veiled threat directed at Emma. Before either could respond, Ember let out a loud, agitated neigh from the corral, pawing at the ground as he sensed the tension among the humans. Campbell glanced at the Mustang. "That the wild one you caught? Heard you brought in an expert." He looked at Emma with undisguised skepticism. "Though I didn't realize horse whispering was a viable career option these days." Morgan's jaw tightened at Campbell's dismissive tone. "Ms. Lawrence has accomplished more with that Mustang in a week than most trainers could in a month." Campbell raised his eyebrows. "Is that so? Well, I've always been more interested in results than methods." He turned his attention back to Emma. "Speaking of results, I've drawn up some paperwork regarding the Davidson property. Thought you might want to review my offer before things progress with the county." Emma's voice was calm, though Morgan could sense the tension beneath it. "What makes you think I'm interested in selling?" "Reality, Ms. Lawrence. 3 months of back taxes, a property that needs significant investment, and, from what I understand, a business that's still finding its footing." Campbell's smile was all teeth. "I'm offering you a clean exit, enough to cover your debts and then some." Morgan felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. "Emma's not going anywhere, Joe. In fact, we've just finalized arrangements for her to join the Blackwell Ranch team full-time." Emma glanced at him sharply, but said nothing to contradict the claim. Campbell's expression hardened. "Is that right? Funny. I was just talking with the banker about your operation yesterday. Didn't mention anything about expansion." "Some business decisions don't need bank approval," Morgan replied evenly, "and some matters are private until they're announced properly." The developer studied them both, clearly reassessing the situation. "Well, this is unexpected. Still, my offer stands, Ms. Lawrence. Property's not much use to you if you're working here." He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. "Take a look. No pressure." Emma accepted the envelope but made no move to open it. "Thank you for stopping by, Mr. Campbell." The dismissal was polite but unmistakable. Campbell tipped his hat, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Think about it. Opportunity doesn't knock twice." He turned to Morgan. "We should talk soon about water rights along the north boundary. Developments coming to this valley, whether you like it or not." After Campbell drove away, Emma turned to Morgan, envelope still unopened in her hand. "You didn't have to do that." "Do what?" "Claim I'd accepted your offer. I haven't decided yet." Morgan met her gaze steadily. "I know, but Campbell doesn't need to know that." He nodded toward the envelope. "Aren't you curious?" Emma glanced down at it, then deliberately tucked it into her pocket. "Not particularly. Whatever he's offering, it's not about fair market value. It's about what he stands to gain." They walked back to the corral where Ember was still pacing nervously, disturbed by the confrontation he had witnessed. Emma slipped through the rails and approached him with a quieting murmur. Remarkably, the Mustang calmed at her voice, allowing her to stroke his neck again. "He remembers," Morgan observed from outside the fence. "The trust is building." "Trust has a memory," Emma agreed softly, "but so does fear. One bad experience can undo weeks of progress." She continued gentle strokes along Ember's neck, gradually extending to his shoulder. "That's why consistency matters. He needs to know that no matter who else comes and goes, I remain the same." Morgan watched them, struck by the parallel to his own life. After Sarah died, he had retreated into the consistent routines of ranching, finding safety in their predictability. The idea of change, of letting someone new into his carefully ordered existence, had seemed unthinkable. Until now. "About the job offer," he said finally. "I meant what I said. Full-time position, good salary, benefits. The ranch could use your expertise." Emma remained focused on Ember, her movements smooth and rhythmic. "And if I said I needed time to build my own business, that working for someone else doesn't fit my plans?" Morgan considered this. "Then I'd propose a partnership instead. You maintain your independence, your brand, but we share resources. The Blackwell Ranch facilities and reputation, combined with your methods." She looked at him then, surprise evident in her expression. "A partnership." "Makes sense," he said, trying to keep his tone businesslike despite the sudden acceleration of his pulse. "Your approach complements what we already do. Different markets, different clients. Together we could offer something unique in this region." Emma was quiet for a long moment, her hand still resting on Ember's neck. I need to see Campbell's offer before I decide anything, and I'll need time to think about your proposal. Fair enough. Morgan nodded toward the Mustang. Will you continue with him today? Yes, this morning was just the beginning. She patted Ember's neck a final time before stepping away. I'd like to introduce the saddle blanket tomorrow if he's ready. That soon? Emma smiled slightly. Not to ride, just to let him feel the weight, the texture. Every new element needs time to become familiar. She exited the corral and secured the gate. I should go. I have a client coming at 10, a therapy session with a child from the home. You're doing therapy work already? Morgan was surprised. Just beginning. Word is spreading slowly. She hesitated. You could come watch sometime if you'd like, see the other side of what I do. The invitation felt significant, though Morgan couldn't quite articulate why. I'd like that. As Emma drove away, Pete approached from the barn. Campbell leaving empty-handed? That's a first. Morgan continued watching the road long after Emma's truck had disappeared. He's not used to people who can't be bought. Speaking of which, Pete said carefully, that business about Ms. Lawrence joining the ranch team, that for real? Maybe. Something like it anyway. Morgan turned to his foreman. What do you think of her, Pete, honestly? And the older man considered the question. Unusual lady, quiet but strong, knows her business with the horses, that's for sure. He eyed Morgan shrewdly. And she's the first person I've seen you take a genuine interest in since Miss Sarah passed. Morgan didn't deny it. She's facing some troubles. Campbell wants her property. And you want to help her. It wasn't a question. Pete had known Morgan too long for pretense. Just help? Morgan gave his foreman a warning look that Pete acknowledged with a raised hand. None of my business, boss, just observing that sometimes a man doesn't realize what he's missing until it's standing right in front of him. That afternoon, Morgan found himself driving toward town, toward the Davidson property. He told himself it was simple curiosity about Campbell's interest in the place, nothing to do with his growing fascination with its owner. But as he approached the modest farmhouse nestled against the foothills, something inside him acknowledged the truth. Emma Lawrence had awakened something he'd thought long dead, a capacity for connection that went beyond business, beyond practicality. The Davidson place was modest but well-maintained despite its age. A faded two-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch stood against a backdrop of pine trees, while a weathered red barn and small corral occupied the clearing to the east. As Morgan pulled up the gravel drive, he spotted Emma in the corral with a small figure, a child of perhaps 9 or 10. He hesitated, realizing he was intruding on a therapy session. But before he could back away, Emma looked up and saw him. She said something to the child, then walked to the corral fence as Morgan approached. I should have called first, he said by way of greeting. Probably, she agreed, but there was no reproach in her voice. We're almost finished if you'd like to wait. Morgan nodded, leaning against the fence post. Mind if I watch? Not if you stay quiet and don't make sudden movements. Jamie's working through some anxiety issues. Morgan observed as Emma returned to the child, a boy with dark hair cut close to his head and a wary posture that reminded him of Ember. A gentle mare stood nearby, calm and patient, as Emma guided the boy through what appeared to be breathing exercises. Now touch Daisy just like I showed you, Emma instructed, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. Feel how she breathes. Match your rhythm to hers. The boy placed his small hand on the mare's side, concentrating intently. After a few moments, his tense shoulders visibly relaxed. Good, Jamie. Now let's try walking her to the barrel and back just like before. The child took the mare's lead rope, his movements cautious, but growing more confident with each step. The horse followed willingly, responding to the gentlest guidance. Morgan watched, fascinated by the transformation in the boy's demeanor. By the time they completed their circuit of the corral, Jamie was actually smiling, a small, tentative expression that nonetheless changed his entire face. "Perfect," Emma praised. "You and Daisy are really connecting today." "She likes me," the boy said, his voice soft but clear. "She trusts you," Emma corrected gently, "because you're calm and confident with her. Remember what we talked about. Horses can feel what we feel." The session concluded shortly after, and Morgan watched as a woman, presumably from the children's home, collected Jamie from the porch. The boy waved shyly to Emma before climbing into the car. "That was impressive," Morgan said as Emma joined him by the corral. "The change in him." "Jamie's been coming for 3 weeks," she explained, checking the mare's water trough. "First session, he wouldn't even enter the corral. Trauma creates hypervigilance. Every unexpected movement feels threatening. Like a wild horse," Morgan observed. Emma nodded. "Exactly like that. The difference is horses live in the present. Humans get trapped in the past." She glanced at him. "So, what brings you out here? Checking up on your potential business partner?" There was a teasing note in her voice that Morgan found he enjoyed. "Curiosity," he admitted. "Wanted to see what Campbell's so interested in." "The creek." Emma gestured toward the back of the property. "It runs year-round, even in drought years. Perfect for his vacation cabins." She wiped her hands on her jeans. "Want to see the rest?" They walked together through the property, Emma pointing out the small apple orchard she was trying to revive, the vegetable garden she'd started, the south pasture where she hoped to eventually build a covered arena for her therapy work. "You've got plans for this place," Morgan observed. "Real plans, not just getting by." "I do. Her expression was determined. "If I can figure out the financial part." They stopped at the creek, a clear stream that bubbled over stones worn smooth by decades of flowing water. The cottonwoods along its banks provided welcome shade in the afternoon sun. "Have you looked at Campbell's offer?" Morgan asked after a comfortable silence. "Not yet." Emma skipped a stone across the water. "Part of me wants to tear it up without reading it. And the other part," she sighed, "needs to be practical. 3 months behind on taxes, repairs needed on the barn roof, and winter coming." She glanced at him. "The therapy work is building slowly. Horse training alone isn't enough yet." Morgan nodded, understanding the reality of her situation. "And my proposal? Partnership instead of employment?" Emma turned to face him fully. "Why are you doing this, Morgan? The truth." He met her eyes, finding it strangely easy to be honest with her. "At first, I just wanted Ember trained. Then I saw what you can do, not just with him, but with all horses. It makes business sense." He paused. "But that's not all of it." "No?" "No." The admission felt like stepping into unknown territory. "I've kept to myself since Sarah died. Built walls, focused on the ranch. It was safer that way. And now?" Morgan glanced toward the creek, gathering his thoughts. "Now I'm thinking maybe safe isn't always better, that some walls need to come down." He looked back at her. "You remind me there are other ways to live." The honesty between them felt as clear and refreshing as the creek water. Emma didn't rush to fill the silence that followed, letting his words settle between them. "I need to think about it," she finally said. "All of it. Campbell's offer, your proposal, what I want for my future." "Fair enough." He nodded toward the farmhouse. "Property has potential. Be ashamed to see it turned into tourist cabins." They walked back toward the house where Morgan's truck and Emma's therapy horse waited. The afternoon was waning, golden light slanting through the pines and casting long shadows across the yard. "Tomorrow morning," Emma said as they reached his truck. "I'd like to introduce Ember to the saddle blanket if you want to be there." "I'll be there," Morgan promised. He hesitated, then added, "Thought I might bring breakfast. Save you having to eat on the road." The suggestion brought a smile to Emma's face, a genuine expression that reached her eyes and softened the practical set of her features. "I wouldn't say no to that." As Morgan drove back toward his ranch, he found himself thinking about walls, the ones he'd built around his life after Sarah's death, and the ones Emma Lawrence was somehow managing to dismantle without seeming to try. The irony wasn't lost on him that she used the same approach with both horses and humans: patience, respect, and a willingness to let trust develop in its own time. That evening, reviewing the ranch's financial statements in his office, Morgan found himself repeatedly drawn to the window that faced east, toward the Davidson place. The sensible part of him recognized the risk in what he was considering. A business partnership was one thing, but the feelings developing went well beyond professional interest. Dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold as Morgan loaded the thermos of coffee and container of still warm biscuits into his truck. He'd been up since 4, an hour earlier than usual, baking from Sarah's recipe book, something he hadn't done in years. The familiar motions had brought a mixture of memories: Sarah teaching him to knead dough properly, their shared breakfast before the day's work began, the quiet companionship of early mornings in the kitchen. Yet for the first time, those memories didn't carry their usual weight of loss. Instead, they felt like a foundation, something he could build upon, rather than a ghost that haunted him. When he arrived at the corral, Emma was already there, checking Ember's water. The Mustang watched her movements with alert interest rather than suspicion, a dramatic change from just a week ago. "You're early," Morgan observed, setting the breakfast things on the small folding table he'd brought. "Couldn't sleep," Emma admitted, securing the gate behind her. "Too much on my mind." Morgan noticed the circles under her eyes as she approached, the slight strain in her usually composed features. "Campbell's offer?" "Read it last night." She accepted the steaming cup of coffee he offered. "Better than I expected. Enough to clear the taxes, pay off the medical bills that followed me here, and leave a cushion." Morgan tried to ignore the sinking feeling in his chest. "You're considering it?" Emma cradled the coffee cup, her eyes on the steam rising in the cool morning air. "I'd be foolish not to. On paper, it makes perfect sense. But it feels like giving up." She met his gaze, and he saw determination beneath the fatigue. "I didn't come all this way to surrender at the first obstacle." Relief washed through Morgan, stronger than he'd expected. He busied himself arranging breakfast to hide his reaction. "These are still warm," he said, opening the container of biscuits. "Nothing fancy, but they'll keep you going." Emma took one, her expression shifting to surprise at the first bite. "You made these? They're excellent." "Sarah's recipe," he said, the name coming easier than it once had. "She insisted every rancher should know basic cooking. Said a man who could handle a herd of cattle but was defeated by a batch of biscuits wasn't much of a rancher." Emma smiled. "Sounds like a wise woman." She was. Morgan found himself wanting to tell Emma more about Sarah, about the life they'd built together, about how losing her had nearly broken him. But now wasn't the time. Ready to introduce Ember to the saddle blanket? They ate quickly, then Morgan watched from outside as Emma entered the corral with both the familiar rope halter and a small square of fabric. Not the actual saddle blanket yet, just a preliminary step. Ember greeted her with a soft whicker, approaching with only minimal hesitation. The progress was remarkable. When she stroked his neck and shoulders, the Mustang leaned slightly into her touch. "Look at that," Morgan murmured. "He's seeking contact now." He's learning that touch can be pleasurable, not just threatening. Emma carefully showed Ember the fabric, letting him sniff it thoroughly before gently rubbing it against his neck. The horse tensed initially, but didn't pull away. After about 20 minutes of this careful introduction, Emma did something unexpected. She turned to Morgan and beckoned him to join them in the corral. "Are you sure?" he asked, surprised. "Might set him back having someone new approach. He needs to learn to accept others, not just me." Emma held Ember's halter gently. "Besides, he's seen you every day. You're a known entity." Morgan entered cautiously, keeping his movements slow and deliberate as he'd observed Emma doing. Ember's ears flicked forward, his posture alert, but not panicked. "Talk to him," Emma instructed softly. "Let him recognize your voice up close." "Hey there, Ember," Morgan said, feeling slightly foolish but trusting Emma's guidance. "You're doing good work with Ms. Lawrence here." To his amazement, the Mustang didn't shy away as he approached. When he stopped a few feet distant, Emma handed him the fabric square. "Just like I did," she said. "Let him smell it first, then touch his neck if he allows it." Morgan followed her instructions, offering the fabric for inspection. Ember stretched his neck, nostrils flaring as he investigated this new development. Then gradually the horse relaxed enough for Morgan to brush the fabric lightly against his shoulder. "That's it," Emma encouraged. "He's accepting you." The moment felt profound, not just the Mustang's trust, but Emma's trust in allowing Morgan into this delicate process she'd been nurturing. When Ember eventually stepped back, signaling he'd had enough for now, Morgan felt oddly exhilarated. He struggled to find the right words. "I know," Emma said simply, understanding in her eyes. They exited the corral together, the morning sun now fully above the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch yard. Morgan found himself walking closer to Emma than strictly necessary, their shoulders occasionally brushing. "About Campbell's offer," he said as they reached the breakfast table. "And mine." Emma looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about both all night. And I'm not selling to Campbell." Her voice was firm, decisive. "Whatever happens, that's not the answer." Morgan nodded, relief evident in his face. "And the partnership idea?" "I think," Emma began, but was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. 2 county sheriff's cars pulled into the ranch yard, followed by Joe Campbell's truck. The developer emerged with a satisfied expression that immediately put Morgan on alert. Sheriff Taylor approached them, looking uncomfortable. "Morning, Morgan. Ms. Lawrence." "What's this about, Jim?" Morgan asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew. "Got some papers here regarding the Davidson property." The sheriff glanced at Campbell, then back to Emma. "County's moving to seize for unpaid taxes. Mr. Campbell here has submitted a priority bid for the auction." Emma's face paled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "That process takes months. I've only been behind for 3 months," Campbell interrupted smoothly. "But there's also the matter of the property survey. Seems the original boundaries were incorrectly recorded. The new survey indicates some irregularities that expedite the process." Morgan stepped forward. "What kind of irregularities?" The sheriff handed Emma a document. "According to this, part of the Davidson property encroaches on county land. Changes the legal status." "That's impossible," Emma said, scanning the paper. "The property lines have been established for decades." Campbell shrugged, barely concealing his satisfaction. "Records get lost, mistakes happen. Fortunately, I'm still willing to make a private offer before this becomes official. Save everyone the trouble of a public auction." Morgan recognized the tactic immediately. Create a false crisis, then offer a solution that benefits only yourself. He'd seen Campbell use similar methods before with other landowners. "We'll need time to review this with a lawyer," Morgan said firmly. "Of course," Campbell agreed magnanimously. "You have until Friday, then the county moves forward." He turned to Emma. "My offer expires at the same time. Just trying to help Ms. Lawrence." As they watched Campbell and the sheriff drive away, Emma's hands were trembling slightly despite her composed expression. "He falsified that survey," Morgan said quietly. "Probably." Emma's voice was tight. "But proving it in time..." Morgan gently took the paper from her hands. "I know someone who can help. Former surveyor who retired to Bozeman, knows every inch of this valley." Emma looked at him, vulnerability and determination warring in her expression. "Why are you doing all this for me?" The question hung between them in the morning air, demanding an honesty that Morgan had avoided for too long. Morgan looked at Emma standing in the early morning light, her question hanging between them. The woman who had come into his life barely 2 weeks ago had somehow managed to upend the careful isolation he'd maintained for a decade. The answer she deserved required an honesty he'd avoided, even with himself. "Because you remind me there's more to life than just surviving it," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Because I see how you work with those horses, with that boy from the children's home, with patience and respect instead of force, and it makes me wonder what I've been missing all these years." Emma's eyes widened slightly, clearly not expecting such candor. "I spent 10 years building walls," Morgan continued, the words coming easier now that he'd begun. "Made the ranch bigger, made myself smaller, told myself it was enough." He gestured toward the corral where Ember watched them curiously. "Then you showed up with your different way of doing things, and suddenly, enough didn't seem enough anymore." A soft flush colored Emma's cheeks, but she held his gaze steadily. "Morgan, let me finish," he said gently. "I'm helping you because I want to, because I believe in what you're building here, and because..." He hesitated, then pushed through. "Because I care about what happens to you more than I expected to." The vulnerability of the admission hung in the air between them. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound the soft morning breeze rustling through the nearby cottonwoods. "I care about you too," Emma said finally, her voice quiet but clear. "That's why I can't let you risk getting tangled in my problems with Campbell." Too late. Morgan's expression softened into a rare smile. "I'm already tangled, and Campbell's been a thorn in my side long before you came along." Something shifted in Emma's face, a decision made, a barrier lowered. "Then I accept your help and your partnership offer with one condition, which is that it's a true partnership. It's a equal standing, equal say. I didn't leave Philadelphia to work under someone else's direction again." Morgan nodded, feeling an unexpected lightness. "Agreed. Blackwell Lawrence Equestrian, or Lawrence Blackwell if you prefer." "We can figure out the name later," Emma said with a hint of amusement. "Right now we need to deal with Campbell and that survey." They spent the morning making calls, first to Morgan's surveyor friend, who agreed to drive down from Bozeman immediately, then to a lawyer Morgan knew in Helena who specialized in property disputes. By noon, they had the beginnings of a plan to counter Campbell's maneuver. The original survey markers should still be there, Morgan explained as they drove out to the Davidson property later that day. "Stone cairns along the creek, blazes on the old pines. If we can document those, it'll contradict Campbell's falsified survey." Emma nodded, her expression determined. "And your friend can verify them? Jim Reeves helped survey half this valley back in the 70s. If anyone can authenticate those markers, it's him." When they arrived at the farmhouse, Morgan was surprised to see Pete's truck already there. His foreman was on the porch, deep in conversation with 2 other men Morgan recognized as neighboring ranchers. "What's this about?" he asked as they approached. Pete straightened. "Word got out about Campbell's play. Folks are concerned." "About me?" Emma looked surprised. The older of the two ranchers, Harry Simmons from the Double S, shook his head. About precedent, ma'am. Campbell pulls this off. None of our properties are safe. Boundaries get reinterpreted. Taxes get accelerated. Next thing you know, we've got vacation cabins where cattle should be grazing. Morgan hadn't considered the broader implications, but the men were right. Campbell's tactics threatened more than just Emma's property. They threatened a way of life. We're heading out to check the original survey markers, Morgan explained. My old friend Jim Reeves is driving down to verify them. Need help? Pete asked. More witnesses, more documentation, stronger case. Morgan glanced at Emma, who nodded. We'd appreciate it. The afternoon became a community effort, with the men fanning out across the property, locating and photographing the original boundary markers. When Jim Reeves arrived from Bozeman, his expertise confirmed what they already suspected. The boundaries had been established correctly decades ago. Campbell's new survey was a fabrication. Got all I need, Jim declared after several hours of meticulous work. This property line hasn't moved in 50 years. Campbell's survey is worth less than the paper it's printed on. Relief washed over Emma's face. Thank you, all of you. As the others packed up their gear, Morgan found himself alone with Emma by the creek, the same spot where they'd talked the day before, though it felt much longer ago. We're not out of the woods yet, he cautioned. Campbell won't give up easily. No, she agreed, but we have truth on our side now, and apparently, neighbors. That's how it works out here. People stick together when it matters. Emma was quiet for a moment, watching the creek water flow past. I never had that in Philadelphia. Colleagues, yes. Community, no. Morgan found himself studying her profile, the determined set of her jaw softened by the waning afternoon light. Earlier, before Campbell showed up, you were about to tell me something about the partnership. She turned to face him, something vulnerable and hopeful in her expression. I was going to say I think it could work, not just professionally. The implication sent a warmth through Morgan's chest that had nothing to do with the summer sun. I think so too. Later, as the sun began its descent behind the mountains, they returned to his ranch for the evening session with Ember. The Mustang greeted them with a whicker that sounded almost welcoming, approaching the fence as they neared. He's looking for you now, Morgan observed. That's new. He's making his choice, Emma replied, her voice soft with satisfaction, deciding that human connection might be worth the risk. The parallel wasn't lost on either of them. As Emma worked with Ember, now successfully introducing the actual saddle blanket, Morgan found himself contemplating choices of his own. The walls he'd built after Sarah's death had seemed necessary at the time, protection against further loss. But watching Emma with the once wild Mustang, he understood what those walls had really cost him. When Emma finished the session, she joined Morgan outside the corral, her face flushed with success and the evening's exertion. He's ready for the saddle tomorrow, I think. Just to feel its weight, not to ride yet. Progress, Morgan said, and they both knew he wasn't just talking about the horse. As they stood together in the gathering twilight, the ranch quiet around them, Morgan made another choice. Slowly, giving her plenty of time to step away, he reached for Emma's hand. She didn't pull back. Instead, her fingers intertwined with his, warm and steady and sure. The morning of the deadline arrived with a clarity that seemed fitting, skies washed clean by an overnight rain, mountains standing crisp against the horizon. Morgan found Emma already at the corral when he drove up, her expression serene despite the confrontation that lay ahead. "Ready for today?" he asked, joining her at the fence. "For all of it," she replied, and he understood she meant more than just the meeting with Campbell. Ember stood nearby, watching them with intelligent eyes, the saddle now resting comfortably on his back, a milestone achieved over the past 2 days. Morgan surveyed the Mustang's transformation with quiet amazement. Hard to believe that's the same horse from 2 weeks ago. He was always this horse, Emma said softly. He just needed someone to see past his defenses. Her gaze shifted to Morgan, the meaning clear in her eyes. They worked together with Ember for an hour, the Mustang now accepting both their touches, responding to basic commands, building on the foundation of trust Emma had established. When Pete arrived to tell them Campbell was waiting at the main house with his lawyer, they were ready. "Let him sweat a little longer," Morgan said, finishing what they'd started with Ember. Some things were too important to rush. Campbell was pacing the porch when they finally approached, his usual polished appearance showing signs of strain. His lawyer, a sharp-dressed young man from Bozeman, stood nearby, briefcase in hand. "You're late," Campbell snapped. "Actually, we're right on time," Emma replied calmly, checking her watch. 10 o'clock, as agreed. Morgan gestured everyone inside, where Jim Reeves and their own lawyer from Helena were already waiting. The tension in the room was palpable as they all took seats around the large oak table that had belonged to Morgan's father. Campbell wasted no time. "Have you considered my offer, Ms. Lawrence? Today's the deadline." "I have," Emma said evenly. "I'm declining." The developer's face hardened. "Then the county proceeds with seizure. Your choice." Their lawyer, Catherine Mills, smiled thinly. "About that." She opened a folder and slid documents across to Campbell's attorney. "We filed an injunction against the county proceeding based on evidence of fraudulent survey documents." Campbell's lawyer examined the papers, his expression gradually shifting from confidence to concern. "These are serious allegations." "With substantial proof," Jim Reeves added, pushing forward his own documentation. "I certified those original boundaries myself nearly 50 years ago. They haven't changed." Campbell's composure slipped further. "This is a delaying tactic, nothing more." "Actually," Morgan interjected, "the county commissioner called this morning. Seems your nephew at the assessor's office has been suspended pending investigation." He leaned forward. "Falsifying government documents is a felony, Joe. Is that a risk you're willing to take?" The room fell silent as Campbell weighed his options, clearly realizing his position had deteriorated significantly. "Furthermore," Catherine continued, "we've filed a formal complaint regarding your pattern of pressuring landowners through questionable means. The state attorney general's office has expressed interest." Campbell stood abruptly. "This isn't over. Development is coming to this valley whether you like it or not." "Maybe so," Emma replied calmly. "But it will happen legally, with proper procedures and community input, not through manipulation and threats." After Campbell and his lawyer departed, the atmosphere in Morgan's living room lightened considerably. Jim Reeves shook their hands before leaving, promising to submit his official report to the county by the end of the week. "This buys you time," Catherine advised Emma, "but you'll still need to address the back taxes." "Already handled," Morgan said, meeting Emma's questioning gaze. "Consider it the first investment in our partnership." When they were finally alone, Emma turned to him. "You paid my taxes." "I did." He held up a hand as she began to protest. "As a business partner, we'll work out the details later, but I wasn't about to let Campbell win on a technicality." Emma studied him for a long moment. "Partnership," she said finally. "Equal standing, equal say." "Exactly as agreed." Her expression softened. "Thank you, Morgan. Not just for the taxes, but for everything these past 2 weeks. I came to Montana looking for a fresh start, but I found something I wasn't even looking for." "Same here," he admitted, the words coming easier now. "I wasn't looking for anything except someone to train that Mustang." They made their way back to the corral, where Ember greeted them with a soft nicker. The change in him was remarkable, still proud and spirited, but no longer afraid. no longer seeing humans as threats to his freedom. "When will he be ready to ride?" Morgan asked, as they watched the horse move confidently around the enclosure. "Soon, but that's not the most important milestone." Emma turned to face him fully. "The most important moment is when he chooses connection over isolation, when he decides that being with humans enhances his life rather than diminishes it." Morgan understood she wasn't just talking about the horse. "And has he made that choice?" "I think he has," Emma said softly. "But choices need to be renewed every day. Trust isn't built once and forgotten." "No," Morgan agreed. "It needs care and attention." He hesitated, then added, "Like any relationship worth having." The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they stood together, watching Ember explore his world with newfound confidence. The Mustang approached them at the fence, stretching his neck to accept Morgan's touch without hesitation. "I never expected this," Morgan admitted, not just referring to the horse. Emma smiled, the expression reaching her eyes and illuminating her entire face. "That's the beauty of patience. It creates space for unexpected things to happen." Morgan found himself drawn to that smile, to the quiet strength behind it. With a gentleness that matched her approach to the horses, he reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "I'd like to kiss you," he said simply, "if that's something you'd welcome." Emma's eyes held his, warm and steady. "I would." Their first kiss was like the Mustang's first willing contact, tentative at first, then blooming with trust and possibility. When they parted, Morgan kept her close, unwilling to step away from this newfound warmth. "My horses needed a gentle touch," he murmured, "and so did I." Emma's smile was answer enough as they stood together in the lengthening shadows, Ember watching curiously from the fence line. Three souls who had found their way to trust, one patient moment at a time.